Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the latest in the Live Better Longer series from AFAR and Prevention. Today's topic is Secrets from the Longest Living Animals. I'm Sarah Smith, the editor in chief of Prevention, where the best thing about my job is that I learn something new every day and about 50 new things on the days that I get to be a part of the Live Better Longer series with AFAR, because these events give me a chance to ask the best experts in the field about their research and what it means for all of us. This is a series that I hope you'll join us for in the future. And if you've been with us in the past, welcome back. AFAR is a leader in supporting aging research, making sure that scientists can continue to make great strides in understanding how we can stay healthy across our lifespan. And prevention has a long history of bringing science backed and forward thinking advice and ideas to people across the country. So today, I'm thrilled to be talking to Stephen Austad, AFAR's scientific director, who's a professor at the University of Alabama at Binghamton, and author of Methuselah Zoo: What Nature Can Teach Us About Living Healthier, Longer Lives. We're going to be giving away 50 copies of this book, which I'll tell you more about at the end of our session. But those will be 50 very lucky people because I loved this book. It's absolutely fascinating, and I could probably talk to Steve about termites and elephants all day, but I will try to be restrained and make sure we cover as much ground as possible. So, Steve, thank you so much for being here and for writing this
Well,
book.
well, thank you. It's delightful to be here, Sarah.
Well, to start us off, I would love it if you could tell us how you got interested in this particular subject. I read in your book that you've actually been studying aging a long time, longer probably than you actually were thinking about it in your personal life, and also that you have some interesting experiences with animals. So I'd love if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, I got into science actually kind of by accident. I was trained big cats for the movie industry for a number of years, mostly lions. And eventually I decided I didn't want to do that for the rest of my life. And I decided to go to graduate school and study animal behavior in a more formal and scientific way rather than just studying it a way of saying, how can I figure out how to keep this lion from eating that actress? And when I went to graduate school, I was not interested in aging at all. I was actually interested in combat because I'd spent all this time trying to figure out how to keep lions from attacking one another because I had more than 20 lions that were trying to get to work together in the same group. Um, and as a postdoc, I went off to Venezuela to work on a group of birds that were interesting from the standpoint of their behavior, but I had a side project that I started with a friend, and this was on opossums. And these opossums were very similar to the ones we have in the US. It would take a real expert to tell them apart. It had nothing to do with aging, but I radio collared the animals, and every month I would capture them again, and I would look in their pouch, and I would measure their little young in their pouch and all. And what I discovered, and it was absolutely shocked, was that they aged incredibly fast. In a period of 3 to 4 months, they would go from being a healthy, young, vigorous adult to being parasite ridden with shrunken muscles and cataracts and arthritis, all kinds of the things that you associate with advanced age. And I just got puzzled by why would that happen so fast to an animal that I would assume aged about as fast as a house cat, because it's about the same size as a house cat. And it was that spark of curiosity that really started me off in this direction that I've stayed in ever since.
That is fascinating, from big cats to opossums to now you're helping all of us know more about aging. I love it. So actually, let's define longevity and aging before we really dive in. How do you see them differently, and how do you determine whether an animal is worth discussing in this context and putting in your Methuselah zoo?
So longevity is simply how long something lives, and but things can live for a long time in a fairly decrepit state, particularly if they're in a zoo or the laboratory. So, aging is the process by which a healthy young adult goes to be a frail and feeble, weak, old individual. And some animals don't age appreciably in nature. Actually, one of the things that I focus on in the book is how long animals live in the natural environment as opposed to how long they live in the zoo or the laboratory, because it's challenging to live in the real world out there. There are predators, storms, all kinds of things that can kill you. And so the amount of time that an animal can live in the wild, it's usually quite healthy. So I think that gives us an indication of how long an animal can stay healthy. And of course, people, what we really want to do is keep people healthy as long as we can.
Right. So, how do you really know even the age of an animal or how an animal is living in its natural environment?
Well, it really depends on the animal. For short-lived animals, quite often scientists will study them for their entire lives and know that way. But where it becomes a lot more difficult is for animals that live a long time, longer than the career, let's say, of most biologists. In that way, we have to use some sort of indirect measures. For instance, to um, estimate the age of something like a Greenland shark that can live almost 400 years, or a whale that can live over 200 years, is we actually analyze the proteins in their eyelids, because there are certain ways to tell how old those proteins are. So the longer an animal lives, though, the more difficult it becomes, unless by accident. Sometimes you learn how long something lives by accident. So one of the longest live bats is Brant's bat, which is just about weighs about as much as a two nickels put together, and but they can live over 40 years in the wild. But the only reason we know that is because some people in the 1960s went out and put a bunch of rings on the legs of bats, and somebody else years later stumbled into the same cave and happened to find them. And again, that's the only way that we know. So it's surprising if you start digging into it how difficult this is to determine, even for animals that you would think we'd know really well, like our closest relatives, chimpanzees, where we still only have a kind of a vague idea how long they live.
That's so interesting. And I mean, from 400-year-old sharks, and I love the idea of bat being found by the next generation of scientists. But they're not people, right? So why are we looking at them besides the fact, just for the fascination of it? Why do you look at them when you think about people? Can you give an example of an animal that might have something to teach us?
Sure. Although I have to admit, although don't tell anybody that it's the fascination with the animals that drives a lot of this for me. I really love that.
Yeah.
So we tend to think that we're somehow very, very special because we can live 100 years or so. But it turns out if you properly think about aging and you calculate it according to, let's say, the rate at which animals use up energy, then there are a lot of animals that age more successfully than humans do. And I think that we can learn something about slowing aging and maintaining human health from really focusing our research efforts on those animals instead of the animals that we study now in the lab, which are the animals that are about as unsuccessful at aging as you can imagine. And let me just give you a nice comparison here. So the laboratory mouse, which is the workhorse of biomedical research, if we're not talking about humans, lives about 3 years, up to 3 years in the laboratory, but in the wild, it only lives 3 or 4 months. And that's because if you're a mouse sized thing and you're living in the wild, there's lots of predators. It can get cold. You can eat bad food. You cannot eat enough food. There's lots and lots of things that can kill you. So a mouse in the wild living 3 or 4 months doesn't really age. It dies before it can age. In the laboratory, though, it ages dramatically. They lose their muscles, they get cataracts, they get cancers. They even lose the ability to walk. They get hind limb paralysis. Contrast that with something that's about the same size, which is a house sparrow. And the most common bird in the world, probably everybody would recognize a house sparrow. A house sparrow can live up to 20 years in the wild. So, right off the bat, we've got something that's dramatically more successful at staying alive in the wild than a mouse is. But it does that in spite of having some physiological traits that, if you didn't know anything else, would make you think, oh, they got to be short lived. For instance, has about twice the metabolic rate of the mouse. And we generally think of a faster metabolic rate as being associated with shorter life. It also has a higher body temperature than a mouse. Birds have body temperatures 104, 105, 106 degrees normally. And that makes a lot of the damaging processes of aging proceed faster, or it should, according to what we think we know. But yet they somehow manage that. Plus, the birds have levels of blood glucose that would make them diabetic if they were human. And uncontrolled diabetes is actually quite an excellent mimic of accelerated aging. So since house sparrows do not control their diabetes or their blood glucose in the wild, you'd think they might be accelerating their aging. But despite all that, they live 20 times longer than the mouse in the wild and 7 times longer than a mouse, given all the protection and food and healthcare we can give it. So I think the house sparrow, despite its commonness, has a lot to teach humans about how to stay healthy longer.
That's fascinating. I want to dive more into all of that, but before we start talking about some of those specifics, I noted in your book that you point out what the biologist Leslie Orgel said about evolution is smarter than you are. And I found that really fascinating. And I wondered if you could just speak to that for a second in the context of aging.
Yeah, so I love that quote. And the idea is that evolution has had billions of species over billions of years with which to tinker with the biology of those species, and including the biology of aging. So, for billions of experiments over billions of years, you have to imagine that evolution might have come up with some solutions that we would never think about. And in fact, our pharmaceutical industry has tacitly admitted that, because most of our drugs have originated in natural products
Mm.
that they've either used the natural product themselves or else tweaked it to make it a little bit better. So it makes sense that if nature has produced chemicals that can help us fight cancer and heart disease and can stimulate our immune system, that nature's probably come up with some pretty good solutions to combating the really damaging processes of life, which is what aging is all about.
Right, right. So the more we can look to nature and understand the animals around us, which for the record, agree with you, learning for the sake of learning and knowing more, can't beat it. But it's really exciting to think that we can then also take some of this and apply it. So, okay, so you mentioned metabolic rate, and I'd love to, broadly speaking, could you tell us, 3 or 4 or so qualities in these animals that you've looked at that affect their longevity and aging?
Sure. Now metabolic rate is clearly important. In fact, there's a whole theory of aging called the rate of living theory, which says that longevity is really determined by metabolic rate. Now, that's an oversimplification, but it's clearly an important characteristic. And it's pretty funny because if you took it literally, you'd say, well, the worst thing you could do for your health is to exercise, because that just revs up your metabolic rate. And in fact, an early aging researcher really took that to heart, Raymond Pearl, who came up with the words, the rate of living theory. And he wrote a paper called Why Lazy People Live the Longest. And he made it a point that he was not exercising at all. So if you really believe this literally, it would empty out the health clubs and all. So it's not true in the detail, but the basic idea is that if you take 2 animals, one of which eats um, 30 times less than another animal and processes that food slower, it's likely to live longer. And here's an example: a crocodile, the size of a person, eats about 30 times less than a person. Now, they don't live longer than a person, but they live about as long as we do, which is unusual. I mean, we're exceptionally long lived for animals that have our metabolic rate. So it's a player. The longest lived animals live in cold places and are cold blooded. So that means that their metabolic rate is declining the colder they get. So the Greenland shark lives in water that's just about freezing. The tuatara, that's a 2-foot lizard-like thing that lives in New Zealand, lives over 100 years, and it lives in the coldest environment of any reptile. So there's this relationship, and then large animals have a lower metabolic rate per cell than small animals, and large animals, on the whole, live longer than small animals. In fact, that's one of the most robust patterns in nature, is that small species are shorter lived than large species. It's true of mammals, of birds, of reptiles, of salamanders, of clams and cohogs. So that's a very general pattern, and a lot of it is driven by metabolic rate. The other thing that really is important is the safety of the environment that you live in. One of the patterns is that animals that live in highly protected places tend to live a long time. And there's a logic there, which is if you live in a highly protected place where you're not likely to get killed by some kind of accident, then nature suddenly has motivation to give you a long lasting heart and long lasting eyes and all, because you're likely to be able to take advantage and leave more offspring the longer you live. So things that live in safe environments tend to live longer. It's one of the reasons I think that naked mole rats, which spend their lives underground, where it's really quite safe, live so long. Why salamanders that live in caves, where it's the top predators, they live so long. Seabirds that live basically on islands in the middle of the ocean. All of those things are places that have an exceptional degree of, let's say, environmental safety associated with them. And again, it's not the safety itself, it's the long history of safety that has made evolution favor any variants that arose that would give you a longer lasting heart, longer lasting immune system, longer lasting muscles.
That's so interesting because I was intrigued by how many animals that you wrote about live in what we'd consider very inhospitable places, the deep underground and remote islands and in cold water. I'm hearing what you're saying about the safety aspect of those, which is interesting. Although the cold still and the deep cold water. I mean, I guess is that safe for them? And is there something that we can learn from that? I mean, it's obviously not so simple as, well, we should all go move to a deep underground tunnel, topically. But what
No, or yeah, or take cold showers every day. By the way, I have to say that Raymond Pearl, the person that thought that exercising would be bad for your health, died of a heart attack at age 61. So in the long run, that theory just didn't work out. Um, I think we might be able to learn something from space travel. Most of us don't want to live a longer life by living a slower life. Most of us would like to maintain our activity. In fact, to me, at least, a lot of the joy of life is in the activity. But imagine there are times at which slowing everything down could be advantageous. And over a long period of space travel might be one of those times. So there are people who are working on ways to allow people to hibernate, let's say, because that could be an interesting way to pass those, months that you're waiting to get to Mars or Jupiter or Saturn or wherever.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. So we'll hibernate and then maybe we'll live in this, new environment. That's
Yeah.
big ideas. And some of this living slowly that you're mentioning, you talk about tortoises. Can you talk a little bit like what you know?
Yeah, tortoises. So, so tortoises, again, they live so long, we're not exactly sure how long they live. There's a lot of interesting mythology associated with it, but they live a very slow life. So a tortoise's heart beats about 6 or 7 times a minute. Um, and they walk maybe a mile in a day if they're in a full out 24-hour sprint. In fact, their heart beats so slowly that my wife one time saw a group of veterinary students try to figure out if the tortoise was alive or not, and they had an EKG on it. So they were watching, but the heart was beating so slowly every time it would beat. They thought, well, wait, maybe somebody slammed a door down the hall, and that made the needle go. So they can clearly live a very long time, but I'm not sure how much that's going to translate
Mhm.
into something that humans are capable of using. I think the things that are going to translate are the things that live fast but also stay healthy.
Okay.
Um, and so the tortoises, I think, are incredibly interesting. Um, but I don't think they're the model that we want to try to learn about human aging.
What's a better model of living maybe a little faster and going for more walks than a tortoise? But
Yeah, well, I mean, that's one of the things that I like about the birds is that they have these things like a high body temperature, high glucose, rapid metabolic rate, but they live exceptionally long. The longest live bird for its body size is a bird called a Manx shearwater, which is an ocean-going bird, and it weighs about a pound, so it's smaller than a small cat, and they've lived into their 50s in the wild. And what makes that particularly interesting is that they have this annual migration from the North Atlantic to the tropical Atlantic. So they go from like Iceland and Scotland to Brazil and Argentina and back again. And they do that for year after year after year. One ornithologist calculated that a 50-year-old Manx shearwater had to have flown at least 5 million miles in its lifetime, which I think is almost as much as I've flown in my lifetime. But hopefully they had a lot more fun than I did.
yeah, I'd love to hear more about how an animal's size affects its ability to live well longer. You talk about both termites and elephants, hugely different in size. So how are they alike? And where does our human size fit in? And we have an audience question on this too, so I'm going to put that to you. But then I
Yeah. So humans, I have a sort of quick and easy way to compare how long things live, factoring in lifespan. And so if you take all the gazillion species of mammals, 5,000 species of mammals, and you line them up, this is how big they are, this is how long they live, it makes a fairly straight line. And you can use that line to say, well, for an animal this size, how much longer, how much shorter does it live than an average mammal? So humans live about 4.5 times longer than an average mammal of our size, which would be something like a mountain lion. Uh, and so um, that's pretty interesting. Now, one of the hypotheses for why bigger animals are longer lived is, first of all, they have slower metabolic rates, but also their size creates in itself a safer environment. And if you think of it this way, if the bigger an animal is, the fewer predators it's likely to have. The uh, because of the slower metabolic rate, the longer they can go without food or water, so the better they would be at surviving a drought or a famine. Um, Usually, they live at a much lower density, so they would not transmit diseases as much. So you can see that just by virtue of their size alone, they have the metabolic rate in their favor. They have the fact that they're creating their own safe environment. And you put those things together, and I think that explains a lot, but not everything. Now, why do people live 4 times as long? So all the primates, it turns out, are longer lived than average, and we're longer lived than other primates. Some people attribute it to our large brain. course, we're primates. We have large, even non-human primates have large brains, but we have the largest by far for our body size. And you could imagine that would help you make sensible decisions in nature, but also it might help you be more finely attuned to things that are going on inside your body. You know,
Mm.
your brain is doing things that you're conscious of, but it's doing all kinds of things that you're not conscious of as well. And so there's an idea that having a large brain is really beneficial for health. And I one time looked at that across mammals, and I didn't find a lot of evidence for it except in the primates. In the primates, having a large brain seems to have some advantages that I wish we knew more about. But yeah, I mean, we like to say it's because we're so intelligent, but you know, um, maybe that's true, and maybe there's something more, I don't know, more blasé that explains it.
Right. We have an audience question that's related to this, and I wonder if you could just address it now, which is, does the size issue, how does it apply within a species? Like, do little dogs live longer than big dogs and horses? And
Yeah, that's a very good question. And we don't know about a lot of species of mammals in this regard, but for the ones that we do know, it seems like it's the reverse,
Mm,
that smaller individuals within a species, like small breeds of dogs, live longer than large breeds of dogs. Smaller mice, as it turns out, live longer than larger mice, and smaller horses live longer than smaller horses. So there could be some now for humans, you might think, so when I graduated from high school, I was 5 feet 4, 105 pounds. And I'd always thought, well, I hope that being small early in life is really related to how long you're going to live. But it turns out the data in human are very difficult to interpret. I mean, you could say, well, women on average are smaller than men, and women live longer than men everywhere, and so maybe that's one thing. But it turns out that taller people seem to be protected against cardiac disease.
mm,
Smaller people tend to be more protected against cancer. But these effects are small. And of course, there's lots of individual variation. But it's an interesting question why the pattern would be different, within a species and between species.
yeah, and the individuality is so interesting too, that we can't forget when we're talking. We're looking at our own dogs or our own selves and families. Yeah, my 15
Yeah.
big dog. You know,
Yeah,
has
well, I mean, it's even true, believe it or not, in the laboratory. So if you have a cage full of mice that are genetically identical to one another and they've all eaten the same food, lived in the same box, and done everything the same for their entire lives, some of them die at a year, some of them die at 3 years. And we don't understand that at all.
You mentioned cancer, and I'd love to talk about that a little bit. That animals do get cancer, but some seem to avoid it better or longer. And
Right.
what do you know about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really fascinating thing because you're right. Some cancer's the number one cause of death for laboratory mice by a lot. Um, and yet there are other animals that are about the same size as the laboratory mice, like naked mole rats, blind mole rats, that get virtually no cancer. So what's the difference? Well, we're trying to figure that out, and we're making some inroads, I think, in understanding those particular things. They seem to produce some uh, some chemicals in their body that protect against cancer, and it's still being worked out, but some of the chemicals are actually chemicals that are used in the cosmetic industry. So we'll see if that really plays out in the long run. A more interesting thing to me is to look at a really large animal. So how is size and cancer resistant related? Well, if you figure that any single cell in your body has the capability of losing control of its growth and growing out of control and becoming a cancer, and every cell in your body does pretty much have that possibility. Well, an elephant is 50 to 100 times bigger than a person. So they have 50 to 100 times more cells than a person. You think that would make them 50 to 100 times more susceptible to cancer in a person. So why don't all elephants get cancer by the age of 2? But they don't. Elephants live. They're the second longest lived terrestrial mammals. They live. They can live up to almost 80, and their life expectancy is in the 40s. Well, for them, we actually have some idea how they do it. It doesn't have immediate implications for humans, but it's a neat biological trick. So we have this gene. All mammals have this gene called TP53, it's sometimes called the guardian of the genome. And what that gene does is if a cell looks like it's starting to become cancerous, it kills the cell. It basically turns on a suicide program in the cell. And over half of cancers, that gene has become mutated, so it doesn't work anymore. So that's how the cell can escape, the suicide pill, when it's becoming cancerous. It turns out, so we have 2 copies, one on each of our chromosomes. Elephants have 20 copies, actually 40, because of 20 copies on one set of chromosomes and 20 on the other. So if one of their copies gets mutated, they've got 19 backups. Mm-hmm. And again, that's a cool solution that nature came up with that I don't see the immediate way that could be translated to humans, but we know there's lots of animals out there with exceptional cancer resistance. Naked mole rats, blind mole rats, whales, because by the same logic, whales, which can be 20 times as large as elephants or 30 times as long, whales live a long time, longer than elephants. How do they avoid cancers? We're getting a few clues from just looking at their genomes, but we need to learn more to figure out if there are lessons for humans from whale cancer resistance.
Right. What did evolution do for them that maybe we're not going to evolve that way, but we can learn from, right?
That's right. Maybe we can make a drug that does the same thing, right?
Yeah. Has that effect. Yeah. You mentioned whales and elephants and the naked mole rats are so fascinating. But one of the things, I really love about your book is all of the investigations into all the different varieties of animals. And, I just love if you could, because you've touched on a number of them so far that we've been talking, but, would you share, just dive a little bit more into an animal that maybe we haven't talked about enough about, one you've mentioned or not mentioned, what interested you about it and what's its lesson for us?
Let me think of the one. Well, I think one that particularly fascinates me is it's called the ohm, or the human fish, which is a salamander that's it's about as long as the span of your hand. So it's about 9 or 10 or 12 inches long. They're blind. They live in caves, so they live in a fairly cool environment, and they live over 100 years. And how something that small, they sort of have adopted the Greenland shark tactic of doing everything slowly. They reach puberty, if you can call it puberty in a salamander, at about the same age that people do, at about 15 or 16 years, actually a little later than most people reach puberty. And then they only have eggs about once every 12 years. So they're going through life very, very slowly, but they're keeping alive exquisitely well. And that's one of the things and they're blind because they live in the cave, so they live in the eternal dark. I haven't thought about it till you got me started on this, but one of the things is there seems to be a correlation between animals that live in the dark that live a long time, because there are these things that live underground. Naked mole rats are virtually blind because they don't need their eyes for anything because they live in the eternal. And then blind mole rats, which also live underground. And interestingly enough, despite the names are not close relatives of naked mole rats, they also have incredible cancer resistance. Maybe there's something underground. I'm thinking that it might have something to do with the resistance, the ability to survive on relatively low oxygen. Both the naked mole rat and the blind mole rat and some of the other animals seem to be able to live in low oxygen that would kill us. Okay, birds can also do this. They can live in, birds, there are birds that fly over the Himalayas, and if you're going to climb the Himalayas, we have to get all this equipment and oxygen tanks and everything else. But they get up from sea level and they fly over the Himalayas in a day. I'm just thinking that the ability to survive the stress of low oxygen might be that's a big stress on the body. It may be that by evolution preparing them to undergo this hypoxia stress, that maybe a side effect of that might be that they resist other kinds of stresses as well, the stresses that our cells inevitably go through at certain times of our lives. Hadn't thought about that cold part before, or the dark part before, but I'm going to from now on.
It sounds like something that could use, more thought and research
Yeah,
from you and
right.
others. And where else do you think that we need more research from? All this investigations you've done. You think what should
Well,
people be?
yeah, the animals that I think we could learn a tremendous amount from are the bats. And I say that because they not only live a long time, and like birds, with the extreme energetic demands of flight, and it may be that surviving, being capable of those extreme energetic demands might also have something to do with their longevity. But they have some other features that I can see directly translating to human biology. For one thing, they hunt, the insect eating ones hunt by screaming and listening to the echo, right? They basically hunt by sonar. This is really a high pitched scream. If you could hear it, it would be deafening. Um, but they maintain that high frequency hearing for 30 to 40 years, which is a lot longer than people maintain their high frequency hearing. I like to drive my students crazy. I have this website on the computer I can go to, and I can pick a frequency and then I can turn up the volume. So it's very easy for me to pick a frequency that I can't hear that they can, and then turn up the volume till they grab their ears and run out of the room screaming. Um, and if we could find a way to maintain our high frequency hearing, that would be very beneficial. The other thing is that bats, if we're in the hospital for a few weeks and we can't get out of bed, when we finally do, or when we're in a space capsule for months, we can hardly walk because our muscles have shrunk. Or if you've had a cast on, so you didn't use the muscle, your muscles shrink. Bats can hibernate, basically be inactive for 9 months, and then they wake up and they fly off. So how the heck did they maintain the muscles to do that for 9 months? And then the last thing that's pretty interesting is their ability to remember spatial things. So people reach that age where they can't remember where they parked the car in the parking lot, right? Bats will fly 50 miles a night in the dark, return to the cave that they came out of, and maybe find their baby among a million other bats in that. That's an incredible amount of spatial memory. And they maintain that clearly for decade after decade after decade. So these are some of the things, besides just long life, but for health preservation, that I think we could learn a lot from the bats.
Yeah, living a good life where you never feel like you're lost and you know where your family is.
Yes, that's right. You never have to walk around the parking lot hitting your key and listening for the horn to honk.
What about you, Steve? What are you working on right now? What's next for you?
Well, I've gotten really interested in sex differences in aging recently. And so I'm real curious to learn why women can survive so much better than men. And if they, if, but they, so here's this paradox but, of sort of the sex differences in aging for people. Women live longer, and it's not just they live longer when they get older, they actually survive better from age 1 to age 5 than boys do. So boy babies don't survive as well as girl babies. For prematurely born babies, being a male baby is considered a risk factor for dying. Um, what is that all about? Women survive famines, they survive epidemics. We've seen it with COVID, right? How the men are hit so much. I'm very interested in understanding that because the other part of that is that late in life, men tend to be healthier than women, the ones that make it to
Mm.
that far. So if we could keep men alive as long as women and keep women healthy as long as men, then I think that would be a nice step towards improving human health. So I'm very interested in that because it seems to be a kind of way of thinking that people have neglected. One of the things that's happened, we now know of 6 or 8 um, drugs that make mice live longer. The interesting thing is almost all of them work in one sex and not in the other sex. And that was a complete surprise to everybody in the field. If you had asked everybody before we had the first one, is there going to be a sex difference? And they're like, well, maybe there'll be a little one. But the fact that a drug would have an effect on one sex and not on the other, we haven't thought about this all when it comes to human pharmacology. I don't think. You know, we even give men and women the same dose, even though
Yeah,
men might be twice as high. That's a little bit crazy.
yeah,
So I this is something that I'm intrigued a lot in now. I'd like to find a way to get back in the field because I really miss the field biology that I used to do, kicking around in the bush and tracking birds. And I love to do that stuff, but it just seems like the research imperatives are drawing me back into the lab where you can learn a lot, but not have nearly as much fun.
yeah. I hope you get back out there. It sounds like you love it.
I
You know,
do.
we actually have an audience question about whether there are biological sex differences in aging in animals. Is that something that you've noticed?
Yeah. Well, like I say, in the mice, there's a sex difference. So what makes it particularly interesting in the mice is that mice, unlike people, it's not always the females that live longer. Sometimes it is. In some colonies it is, and sometimes it's males that live longer. But despite that, you get those sex differences. I think there are animals in the wild that have extreme sex differences where the male might be 10 or 20 or 50 times smaller than the female. Those are very interesting. We might learn a lot about these sex differences. In the reptiles, this is particularly notable because in some species, males are bigger, in some species, females are bigger, and the smaller sex tends to be the longer lived ones, like in humans. Um, so I think there's a lot of interesting things that we can learn from looking at animals where the male lives longer and sometimes the female lives longer. Might be if we only look at animals in which the females always live longer, we're not going to learn as much.
Right. We won't get that whole story, like you were saying.
Right.
Well longer. Um, you know, I'll just add too that anyone who's super interested in this particular subject, we did a Live Better Longer webinar on sex differences, and that recording is it's still there on the AFAR.org site, ready for anyone who wants to check it out. Ben, there's so many great audience questions coming, and I'm going to get to them in just a minute. But before, I really have to ask you, Steve, would you share the story about the wager that you've made about human longevity?
Sure, sure. So in the year 2001, a reporter from the New York Times asked a small group of people who run a think tank on aging, when is the first 150-year-old person going to be here? And nobody wanted to answer. And one of my unfortunate traits is that I tend to blurt out things when nobody else will answer. So I blurted out, I think that person's already alive. And a friend of mine, the demographer Jay Olshansky, later read an account of that and called me up and he said, "You don't really believe that?" I said, "Yes, I do, Jay. We're making enough progress in the biology of aging." Well, he was skeptical. He agreed that we're making progress, but he didn't think that 150-year-old person would be here. So we ended up making a bet. So the bet went like this. Each of us put $150 into an investment account with a stipulation in writing that in the year 2150, if a group of designated scientists agreed that at least one person, and of course it's going to be a woman, had lived 150 years, then in the best case scenario, I would get all the money that had accumulated. In the more likely scenario, my children or grandchildren or great grandchildren would do it. And if not, then his descendants would get all the money. Now, the real miraculous part of this is that $300 we calculated at the historic rate of growth in the stock market in 50 years would be $500 million. But then, about 8 years ago, a reporter convinced us we needed to double the bet so that it would be worth a cool $1 billion. And so we did. We doubled the bet. So now it's sitting there. Actually, Jay's been managing the money, and it's doing quite a bit better than the historical rate of the stock market. So maybe it will be $2 billion that my descendants will get eventually.
I love this. I wish all of us here would be around to find out who wins this. I mean, it'll be you if we're all around to find it.
Yes,
But
that's right.
everyone on this call, tell your children and grandchildren to follow this story, so that someday they'll know. They'll know. Thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
I want to go to some of these terrific questions. There are so many. Let's talk about diet. Actually, we've heard about research around the Mediterranean diet and blue zones, and also about dietary timing. I think like when you're eating intermittent fasting. So, do we know anything about animals, what they're eating, and how that impacts their aging?
We know that we don't know a lot. We know that carnivores tend to be shorter lived for the most part, but we don't know if that has anything to do with their diet or if it has to do with more with their ecological niche and competition. So no, there's all this interesting stuff going on with diet in humans. But one of the things that I think is important to note is that diet is very specific for certain species. And for instance, there are these studies where they feed mice Western diets and they look to see the impact of this. I don't think diet is one of these things that translates across species so easily. So mice in nature, they eat basically grain and whatever insect larvae happen to be mixed in with the grain. We eat a very different diet. I mean, our Paleolithic diet was highly variable, right? Variable depending on where in the world we lived. And we're really, I think, highly selected to eat a lot of different foods. You're right, though. There are these dietary things, the Mediterranean diet, the ketogenic diet, the timing stuff. All of it's being investigated pretty extensively right now in people. And I think that's really where those studies need to go, is in people.
Mhm. Great. Speaking of people and what they're eating, there's a question sort of related to this, but also about their environment and their geography in a little bit of a broader sense. So we know the blue zones, they eat certain things, but is there something more to it than that? And again, this is about people, but we have talked a lot about the different places animals live.
Yeah. So I'm not sure if it's my feeling is it probably has to do with lifestyle more than with genetics. Certainly, there are people that genetically live a long time. There are these long-lived families where everybody lives to 90s or hundreds, and all the other people that get the result. But only about 20 to 25% of our longevity is related to our inheritance. It means a lot more is it related to our environment. So one of the things that you guys do so well at Prevention Magazine, that those of us who do research, we tend to focus on genetics a lot because we know how to tinker with that. But lifestyle factors cannot be overestimated as in their importance. And I tell people, look, if you want to live to be a healthy 110-year-old, you better have the right parents. If you want to live to be a healthy 80 or 90-year-old, then do all the stuff that, have a sensible diet, don't smoke, stay active physically and mentally, all the things that your magazine does such a great job in promoting, actually.
Thank you. That's really our goal is to, we can't help your genetics. We're not doing
That's
that.
right.
We can
You're
help you make
stuck.
the
Yeah.
most of what you've got. Yeah, that's what we're here for. Here's an interesting question. When you were talking about how the lifespan of mice in captivity is longer than in the wild, um, so the question asker says, would you argue that humans are reflective of this living in captivity idea? Now that we've been able to increase our, lifespan, and we develop pathologies as mice now do when they live in captivity. Are we living in captivity?
Um, Largely, yes. And if you look at humans that are living in the wild, I mean, I would consider people living hunter-gatherer life as living as much in the wild as we're living in captivity. Their life expectancy is very short. Life expectancy is around in 30s. A lot of that is due to a lot of infant mortality. But even if you take that away, then even if you say, well, how long do they live if they make it to 15? Well, it's into 60 or something, which we'd consider to be a short life. Now, it's not captivity in a certain sense, in that, at least in our mice in the lab, we take extraordinary measures to keep infectious diseases out of our laboratory colonies. And of course, we're suffering right now, infectious diseases. And that's something that is more like nature and less like the laboratory. But in terms of the fact, I mean, the other thing we do in the laboratory is we give our animals very little opportunity to stay physically active. And we may not take advantage of it, but we have the opportunities to be extremely physically active these days because, we're not exhausting ourselves with the backbreaking work like we used to do 100 years ago. Maybe that's not a good thing, although we're living longer than we did 100 years ago.
Right. Um, I've seen an interesting question about animals living after they're done reproducing. Are there animal grandparents? Or is that a human thing?
Uh, it's a relatively rare, but it does exist among animals, particularly whales. It's well documented, and killer whales have a pretty long. I hesitate to call it menopause because they don't really have menstrual cycles. They have estrous cycles. They have a long post-reproductive life, uh, lasts a decade or more. That's kind of like we do. Interestingly, mice in the lab also have a long post-reproductive life. Mice in the field don't, of course. Now, why that is there's a lot of speculation about that. The favored hypothesis among most people is that women live that much longer because they need to take care of they need to raise their kids because when their kids are young, and that may be it, or they need to take care of their kids.
Mhm.
And we all know what a great help grandparents can be. But that's not the only explanation. A very interesting feature is that if you look at how fertility declines with age, it starts fairly young in women in particular. It starts in the late 20s. Now, that to me is a mystery. You would think that fertility would be preserved. So I don't think of menopause as something like a switch being turned off. What's happened is it's the end of a long period of declining fertility. Why that should be so much faster than the other systems that decline, our hearts, I don't know. I think we need to think about this in a slightly different fashion than we have been now. Fortunately, one of the things that's going on in the field now is that people are starting to study this very, very seriously. And that's great because it's one of the things that we used to say, yeah, everybody knows about it, but nobody is really investigating it. And that's because, most of our research subjects until recently, were men. Um, and so this is a really good change. for the future is that there are really people now working on female reproductive aging and how it impacts health.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, that's great for women, but it sounds like it's going to be really great for all of everyone. Really, the more you
Ultimately, I think it will be. Yeah.
um, we're almost out of time. I'm going to ask a question that came in about the metabolism of birds that fly versus the ones that don't. And I know you talk a bit about flying and animals that fly versus having the ability to fly. I can't remember exactly how you put it, but could you talk a little bit about flight? Because I think that's interesting.
Yeah, so there's an interesting pattern in the birds, which is the ones that are the strong flyers tend to be the ones that live the longest. Um, and an example that I talk about in the book is the turkey, which can fly. Most people don't know that because the turkeys that we have on our plate for Thanksgiving cannot fly.
Mm.
They've been bred to have such a high, big breast muscles that they cannot fly. But turkeys in the wild can fly, but they don't fly much. They flutter from the ground up into a tree to roost. If they want to get away from something, they usually just run. Um, they don't live as long. For a bird, they're really short-lived. The longest lived turkey ever lived about 15 years, which is not as long as a sparrow can live. So there really is something about the rigors of flight and long life that we don't understand that I very much would like to understand.
I look forward to when somebody does, and especially you, because then you can talk about it, and it will be very fascinating. Um, we're just about out of time, so I'm gonna wrap this up and just show everyone reminder about this giveaway. But first of all, I just want to say I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the questions because there are some really good ones. This is a very smart group that we have here, so I hope that everyone will be able to be in touch with one another and do more research and read the book. And we're going to be sending out a survey after this, and the first 50 responses you have a chance to win here this terrific book. But you can also just buy it wherever you buy your books. And I hope that you'll follow AFAR and prevention to find out what we're going to be discussing next. And I'm really, Steve, I can't thank you enough for this fascinating overview of this topic today that you dive more into in Methuselah Six.
Well, thank you, and I can't thank you enough for coming up with such great questions.
Oh, thanks. It's really great to talk to you. All right, everyone, thank you for joining us, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.